Welcome to today's podcast episode. This week, we're talking about brain function and rationality. We're going to be looking at how our brain functions irrationally and really how to prevent that. That's the main focus of this episode. I also want to let you guys know that this is a 3-part series. Today's episode is going to focus on introduction to really the two halves of our brain, which would be the subconscious and conscious parts. And then we're going to take a look in future episodes in this series about how logical reasoning happens and how illogical reasoning happens and what we can do to prevent ourselves from making illogical or irrational decisions, really by understanding how the whole process occurs. This has been huge for me in my journey in learning about the meaning of life and really learning about all the things that pertain to this podcast, such as religion and psychology. It's really important to have that foundation and understand how our brain functions. I don't think people spend enough time really trying to understand these things. And that's the purpose of today's podcast. So for starters, we got to introduce really the two functions of our brain. So most commonly, it's known as unconscious and conscious parts of our brain. So consciously, that's who we are. That's the kind of the voice inside of our head, the person we perceive as making the decisions for us. But in reality, the subconscious part of our brain really lays the foundation to those decisions that the conscious part of our brain does. For ease of terminology and make sure we're all on the same page, because there's different definitions for different things, I'm going to attribute system 1 to the subconscious part of our brain that operates automatically and that we don't consciously control or even identify with as who we are as a human. And this is the same terminology that Daniel Kahneman used in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. A lot of the information for this podcast has come from this book. Highly recommend checking it out. It is pretty dense, but you'll learn a ton of different stuff. So the second system is system 2, and that's consciously who we are. So it's the opposite of system 1. Its main task is allocating attention to various effortful tasks that demand it, such as complex computations. So with that being said, let's jump in to a solid definition of system 1. I think the best way to understand really how these systems work and how they interact with each other is through examples. So we'll start off with system 1. An example system 1 is locating the direction of a sound. So you hear a sound in your house, for example, and you kind of look toward that sound. That's an operation. That's an automatic operation of system 1 as it tries to pinpoint the location of that sound. So something that you are not consciously involved in, it just happens. Another example would be detecting emotion in somebody's voice. You don't have to consciously think about how somebody's feeling when they're yelling at you. Obviously, you know immediately that they're angry. And that, again, is an operation of system 1. Another good example that I use, and I think it really helped me understand what system 1 is all about, is driving on an empty road. So consciously, when you're driving in a busy location, you're really engaged in what you're doing. Maybe you're all the way downtown and it's really busy with traffic and you're really focusing on your driving. That's an engagement of system 2. But if you're driving on an empty road, maybe you're listening to music, might be a little bit late at night, so there's not very many cars on the road. That is system 1 that kicks in and essentially takes that drive for you and does it automatically. I'm sure if you drive a lot, you've experienced where you drive somewhere and you don't really remember consciously driving at all, and that is a good example of how system 1 operates. Now for system 2, I want to bring up some examples that, again, will help us better understand it. So looking for someone with white hair in a crowd of people. So you can look at the crowd of people and you see people automatically as system 1. But the fact that you're looking specifically for somebody with white hair now is a system 2 operation. You're consciously engaged in that activity and focused on white hair in this crowd. System 2. Another good example would be anything like multiplication. So multiplication of, let's say 1 times 2, which is 2, is a system 1 operation. You thought of that answer automatically. You didn't have to think about it. However, multiplying 17 times 32 is a system 2 operation, which you have to consciously be involved in and really think about in order to figure out the answer. Again, I think these are good examples of how each work. There's a few important things to note about each system. So system 1, subconscious, like I mentioned earlier in the introduction of this podcast, is that it lays the foundation for our beliefs that are system 2 operated. So system 1 that we don't know much about really is the main player in our decision making, even though we don't know anything about it at all. And this was really crazy to me. I think it's very interesting and really stresses the point that it's important to try and understand what system 1 is all about so we can make well-informed, rational decisions. Another thing I want to mention is that system 2 is inherently very, very lazy. And this is why system 1 is allowed to have such a grasp on who we are. People in our minds just are lazy. Our minds just are lazy, and we can look at this from an evolutionary perspective. Why would our minds be so lazy? If we think about it, the individual who's more content with just staying put, not really challenging themselves or doing anything risky, is going to be the individual who survives and passes on their genes. While the person who is constantly out challenging themselves, doing crazy stunts and stuff, or just challenging themselves mentally and increasing their vulnerability to different things, has a lower chance of surviving and passing on their genetic information. So that's how we see really system 2, the laziness attribute of system 2 being propagated to today. And it's a big deal, and we have to understand it if we're going to combat that. So now that I've introduced system 1 and system 2, we're going to take a look at how they interact. And I think this is, a good way to understand how they work. And most of this is going to be through examples, and then we're going to get into more specific things. And again, examples of that as well, like associative thinking, priming, and we'll really wrap it all together towards the end. So first I want to talk about how system 2 and system 1 interact when system 2 is depleted. So as we remember, as I mentioned previously, system 2 is inherently very lazy, and system 1 really lays the basis and foundation for our beliefs. So if system 2 is depleted, it obviously makes sense that system 1 is going to essentially take over for system 2. In doing this, us as the individual become much more impulsive. For example, when we are extremely tired, our system 2 tends to be more depleted. System 1 is going to be more impulsive, and that's how we generally act. We can be angry at times. Everybody gets kind of angry when they're very, very tired and sleep deprived. And that's because system 2 is essentially taking a step back and letting system 1 operate as system 2 gets its energy back. Another example of how system 2 operates when it's depleted, or why it can be depleted is when people are inebriated or under the influence of alcohol. In this case, we become more impulsive. Individuals who are extremely drunk are extremely impulsive and don't really think about their actions before doing them. So in this way, system 2 gets depleted due to alcohol, and system 1 takes over, and that's why we see more impulsive behavior of drunk people. And now obviously this begs the question, how do we fix this? And luckily in this case it's pretty straightforward. The first thing is rest system 2. And now how can we do that? Well, one is going to be by sleeping. Sleeping will rejuvenate system 2 and allow optimal functionality of system 2. Another option is just relaxing. Relaxing can let system 2 kind of turn off and let it rejuvenate. Another option is eating food. There is good evidence that increasing blood sugar in your body will increase your ability to think rationally due to the increased stimulation and increased engagement of System 2. So what's the broad takeaway in this little segment here? And it's the fact that System 2 and System 1 work together, but one is much less rational, and that obviously is System 1. System 1, as a result, should not be trusted, and conscious effort is really required to do this. Conscious effort is required to make sure the System 2 is operating when making decisions. Next, we're going to be talking about associative thinking and priming, another way to understand how System 2 and System 1 operate together. And this really gives us a good idea of how to think rationally in these very common situations as associative thinking is. So it all starts off, we're going to define what associative thinking is. And they are ideas that have been evoked will unconsciously trigger many other ideas in a spreading cascade of activity in your brain. So if you mention the color purple or mention the color red, you start to think of objects associated with red or with purple. This is associative thinking. Associative thinking happens all the time and happens with every single decision that we make. Just the way something is worded can induce associative thinking and make you more prone to choose something that you wouldn't necessarily choose. And this is kind of scary, especially when we add on that physically and mentally associative thinking will mutually reinforce themselves. This is called associative coherence. So there's a study actually done about associative thinking and associative coherence on students at a university. This experiment involved asking students to really think about old thoughts. So maybe operating slower or having back pain and things like this. And as a result, these students actually acted old in the preceding hours. And how they did this was that they first invited people into a classroom and promoted them through associative thinking to ponder older thoughts, like I had mentioned before, and then they timed their walk to the next class. And the people who came in the classroom and were associatively thinking about older thoughts ended up walking slower to class. And people who weren't thinking about older thoughts when they came into the classroom walked at their regular speed to class. Now, there have been many more studies about this topic, but this is just one that shows the reciprocal link between physical actions and mental actions through associative thinking. And again, this is called associative coherence. So next, we're going to be asking this question: how do we fix this? Well, first thing is to become aware that this happens, even though we don't notice it. You now know that your System 1 can be manipulated by anyone in any situation, but that is just the first step. So at first, we don't really catch it that much. And obviously that's difficult to do because it's something that operates on System 1. But the fact that we just know that it occurs will help us catch it much more frequently than we would if we didn't know it even happened. Obviously, now the second step would be to keep this in mind when hearing or reading some information. So I'd highly recommend, if you are trying to make a decision on something, or maybe you're looking at different scientific studies or just different papers from different perspectives, even different news outlets with different perspectives, and trying to understand which story is true, keep this in mind when you're hearing or reading this information. Just by keeping this in the front of your mind, your System 2 will be very, very active at catching it. And this is hugely important for discerning information and really determining whether or not the information you've received is valid or invalid. Now, this skill will strengthen as your engagement with various material increases. The more engaged you are, the more active System 2 becomes. And engaged in information is, I feel like it's different for each individual. For me, I'll use the example of reading a book. I'll be reading a book, I will highlight, and that's kind of my first engagement, is highlighting information that I think is valuable. My next is taking notes on those highlights and throughout the chapters in a separate notebook and kind of expanding on these highlights. And oftentimes I don't include all the highlights that I have in the book. I only include a few of them, the ones I think are the most important. And then I'll have a good page of information. Next, after I finish the book or finished big sections of the book, kind of depends on how large the book is or how dense it is, I will do some writing and try and write a few paragraphs about what I learned in that book or in that section of the book. And this, for me, really helps me stay engaged with the material. And I oftentimes find myself seeing things that I recognize from other books. Like, oh, this is an example of associative thinking or priming. And I should be more critical of this information and maybe look for some more opinions or more facts about this certain topic. I really can't stress how important this has been for me in reading tons of different books. You get a book, sometimes you don't know exactly what the author's perspective is, obviously, until you read the book. And sometimes, and I've had this happen to me quite a bit, by the end you're like, wow, I don't agree with this guy at all. Why is that? And I feel like understanding these concepts of rationality, of associative thinking, of priming, help you discern information that he is kind of cherry picking or kind of setting the stage for you to believe something when really it might not be exactly how that seems. So the takeaway message I want you guys to go home with and to remember is that it's very easy for people to trick your mind through evoking associative thinking. However, this can be fixed through the activation of System 2. So now I want to answer some questions that I had throughout my research for these podcast episodes, and that really starts with, why is System 2 less dominant than we think? Even though System 2 is who we consciously are, why is it that System 1 is running the show? Well, the first thing to understand is that System 2 doesn't like cognitive strain. Cognitive strain is anything that is new or takes high amounts of mental effort. Cognitive ease is associated with more familiar things and produces a feeling of safety and security. So familiarity is a function of System 1. We see something that's familiar, we want to associate it with true, because this reduces cognitive strain. This will promote cognitive ease if we are familiar with something. And this can be very, very bad. So if we, for example, are given a question with a multiple choice question with 4 possible answers, and one of those answers, for example, is more familiar because it has more familiar, more easy to understand words, we are much more prone to pick that answer than the other answers, even though this is completely irrational. Obviously, it's irrational just to pick something solely based on the familiarity. We want to be picking things on much more strict criteria than just familiarity. And now this is not completely System 1's fault by being impulsive and being prone or really vulnerable to the idea of familiarity. It's also System 2's fault. System 2 relies on the impression of familiarity when deciding whether or not a statement is true. The problem is that idea of familiarity is coming from System 1, not from System 2. Now this is a little weird, but in a sense, System 2 is determining your view on the validity of a statement by gauging the familiarity. And like I mentioned before, this is not rational. At the same time, System 2 is just taking that information and going with it because it doesn't want to go through the cognitive strain of challenging System 1. So how do we avoid this? Well, again, it's through the activation of System 1, it's through the activation of System 2, which is your more rational agent kind of your brain. So remember, System 2, it's activation of System 2. One example of how System 2 can be activated is simply by furrowing your eyebrows, kind of bringing them close together and squinting your eyes a little bit. This will immediately promote System 2 to activate. And just by doing that alone, you will automatically start thinking more rational due to your increased engagement with whatever material you are currently looking at. The next question we're going to be looking at is, why do we believe things that we shouldn't? We're told a lot of different weird things, and every single person is believing things right now that they probably shouldn't. Me, you, just about every single person. In fact, I would say every single person believes things that are irrational. Why does that happen? The first thing to understand is that we are prone to believe. That's just how we operate. The understanding of a statement begins with an attempt to believe it. And this kind of makes sense. You need to believe that statement and understand those words in order to really coherently get the gist of what is being said to you. Now, this sounds really foreign and really weird, but we can see how this could have came about through evolution. And the fact that when somebody talks to you, you want to initially believe that statement, because what if it's something acting in the now? Like somebody runs by and they say, hey, there's 50 people chasing us, we need to go. If your first impulse is to not believe that individual, the chances are you get left behind or you kind of get weeded out by evolution. But the fact that you instantly believe that is the reason why humans are more successful and the reason why humans have made it this far, and really that reaction in that situation. But this doesn't work well in situations of trying to understand whether or not a statement is valid. What's important to understand is that you can only unbelieve a statement after you've already understood it. And if understanding it involves even a little bit believing it, then you must unbelieve it. So if believing is a function of system 1, unbelieving ends up being a function of system 2. I think a good way to kind of show you that this is actually a real thing and that this happens is to think of those situations where you believe things for just a split second. I think we've all been in those situations. Somebody will say something, even if it's for milliseconds, you believe it, even though it could be a completely absurd statement. That is your system 1 operating. Like we said before, operates impulsively, and it does so in that situation. It's only until your system 2 kicks in that it will unbelieve that statement that it just been presented with. Another piece of the puzzle of why we believe things we shouldn't is the lack of information. So lacking information actually makes it easier to believe something. Now, I thought this was very crazy, but after Kahneman actually explained it in his book, it made a lot more sense to me. And it's the fact that we want to construct familiar and coherent stories in our brain. So if you have a story that goes back and forth between two sides of an argument, for example, it's much harder to make that coherent than it is to listen to one side or one example and get an idea of how your story can be formed and how you can make it as coherent and as rememberable as possible. There's actually been studies done that individuals who are set in a room and forced to listen to both sides of an argument come out and are much less sure about their own opinion on that topic than individuals that only saw one side of the argument. When it makes it's very counterintuitive, at least to me. It makes more sense that the individual who has seen both sides of the argument can make a better, more well-informed decision. But it's actually completely opposite, in that the individual who has only heard one side of the argument is much, much better at making a coherent story and therefore forming their own decision about it, even though it's less informed and obviously irrational, or at least less rational. Another thing that goes along with this is confidence. Confidence in beliefs does not reflect the validity of that belief, but really it just shows that the person has made a coherent story in their brain. So confidence is not correlated at all with validity, it's more with coherence. That's another important distinction to make because it further helps us understand the idea of why the lack of information makes things easier to believe. The next thing we're going to be talking about, and again, this also pertains to why we believe things we shouldn't, is going to be the idea of substitution. If a satisfactory answer to a hard question is not found quickly, System 1 will find a related question that's easier and answer it instead. So there's a good example of this that Daniel Kahneman brings up in a study where they asked people first how they were feeling these days relating to their personal well-being. So how they're feeling. Oh, I'm feeling good, whatever. And then the second question in that batch was, how many dates have you gone on recently? And then for the second group, all they did was flip those questions. So they first asked, how many dates have you been on recently? Then, secondly, they asked, how are you feeling these days? How is your well-being in general? And they learned that in the first set of questions, which they were asked about how many dates they'd been on second, and first about their well-being, that there's no correlation to the amount of dates a person went on and how they were doing. However, in the second group, they found that there was a correlation, and this is due to substitution. In the first set, there was nothing to substitute. The first question that was answered was harder. The second question was answered, didn't really contribute to the question that had been previously answered. However, in the second group, when they were first instructed to think and reflect about their dating life and put how many times they'd been on a date this month, their second question of well-being reflected that answer. This is a perfect example of substitution. Their brains in that situation substituted the question, how are you doing these days? How is your general well-being? They substituted that question for, how's my dating life? Because they had just interacted and really thought about that. We talked about cognitive strain in the beginning. What is easier? What is less strain on the brain? To answer the question that you've essentially already answered, or at least substitute it, or answer a completely new question that takes a lot of energy out of you, or at least some energy out of you. Obviously, it's the route of least resistance, and that's exactly what we see here in substitution. We've covered a lot of information on this episode, and I just want to briefly recap and then end with something that I think is really, really special and really important to understanding this episode and the future episodes that we talk about rationality, about logical reasoning, and about how to think correctly. So first, we'll start with the recap. We started off today's episode looking at System 1 and System 2. We defined System 1, and then we defined System 2 and learned how they interacted through various examples and various situations where System 2 was depleted, for example, and where System 1 could kind of kick in. We also talked about associative thinking and priming. We talked about the importance of engagement when looking at materials, either reading, listening, watching information. That gathering of information, you need to be extremely engaged during that process. We also talked about various questions that I had throughout reading Daniel Kahneman's book and researching this topic in general. We looked over a few of those questions and tried to answer them the best we can using information that we had available. Now, lastly, I want to focus on something else, and this is our ability to exclude ourselves. Daniel Kahneman mentions in his book that we have a very good ability to reject the statistical results of various studies and exclude ourselves from it. For us, it's important that we take these studies and these results seriously if we want to better understand them and avoid the irrational errors we are naturally prone to make. And what I mean by this is that we are prone to exclude ourselves from these things. When we think about associative thinking and the fact that it is irrational, we think about substitution and the fact that it's irrational, we're prone to be like, oh no, that can't be me. I know that's not me. But this is exactly what Kahneman warns us about. This is the worst thing possible. This is the fact that the brain doesn't want to change. We have to force the brain to change. It's not going to change by itself. And the first thing that we can do in order to make sure that happens is take control. And don't exclude ourselves from these statistics. Don't exclude ourselves from these studies. Instead, accept that we are flawed. Accept that we think irrationally and start to fix it. And like I had mentioned before, in order to fix it, we have to first learn. And this is exactly what you've been doing in this podcast episode. And I really appreciate that you've been here and are motivated to learn. That is the most important thing. And it's the first building block to to all of this is first learn the information, learn the different definitions to different information that we've covered. And as we get more familiar with these different concepts of substitution, of priming, of associative thinking, and other concepts we'll discuss in future episodes, the more familiar we are with these, the more comfortable we are finding them. And the more we can find them, the more we can think rationally and make good, informed, valid decisions based on logic, based on rationality, instead of impulse, instead of substitution, instead of priming. Lastly, I want to mention that it's important to have humility and realize that we have been making these mistakes. And that goes again with what I was just talking about. We've made mistakes. We have to be humble in what we believe. If we are to really make any progress in who we are, if we want to think rationally, if we want to think logically, and have a better understanding of information as it comes to us, we absolutely have to be humble in what we believe. If you hold a belief that you hold on to so tight, you're not being humble, and you're not going to be willing to let that go, even if it's incorrect. So with that being said, if you take anything away from this podcast episode, if you forget all the previous information, I really want you to hold your beliefs with humility. Understand other people have different beliefs, and they hold it just as religiously as you do. This is one of, if not the most important thing that I've learned as researching this, is be humble, be open to change. Understand that you don't know everything. You aren't perfectly rational. You don't understand every single topic there is. Instead, there are things that you have messed up on. There are things that you think about irrationally, and if you're holding on them too tight, you'll never let them go. So thanks again. I really appreciate you joining me on this podcast episode, even though there was no visual this time. If you're on YouTube, I apologize for that. But again, thanks for engaging with me today. I would highly recommend staying engaged with this material if you really want to incorporate it into your lifestyle and into your identity as who you are. So what I've done is I've made a PDF of really the main points of these 3 podcast episodes I'll be covering, and it's going to be released in the description of the last podcast episode in the series, which should be coming out late June. So I really hope that you guys take advantage of that and stay engaged with the material and further incorporate it into your lifestyle. Another thing that you guys can do if you want to stay engaged with the material is go check me out on Instagram at atlas.podcast. I try to post relevant information and information that pertains to what we're talking about and what we're discussing at the times that we are. So again, this is just another opportunity to stay involved and stay engaged. You also can absolutely come and ask me questions, DM me questions, drop them in the comment section of any of the platforms, and I will try my best to get back to them. I'd love to do some Q&As in the future. So if you guys would like that, let me know. Thanks again for watching out this podcast. I'll see you next time.